Hello, welcome back to Bioscience Biologists. This week's notes is all about the plasma membrane. So that's what I'm going to title my notes here, plasma membrane. Plasma membrane. The plasma membrane, if you remember from our lecture on lipids, forms what we call a phospholipid bilayer on the outer border of the cell. So that's what I'll write, the plasma membrane, a phospholipid bilayer forming the outer border of the cell. And a qualifier to this is all membranes, all membranes, even those ones around our organelles that we talked about last week, those are still a phospholipid bilayer, but the phospholipid bilayer that forms the outer border of that cell has a special name. That's plasma membrane. And for shorthand, since we'll write this a lot, we can call it PM, plasma membrane. All right, so let's break down what is in a plasma membrane, and it's phospholipids mostly. So the plasma membrane is composed of phospholipids. And if you remember, phospholipids consist of glycerol with phosphate on it, phosphate group. And then there's two fatty acid tails, fatty acid and fatty acid. And if you remember, glycerol, that's just a 3-carbon sugar. So glycerol plus that phosphate group, that forms this really special region of the phospholipid, and that is called the hydrophilic region. And that's because this region of the phospholipid loves water. Glycerol is a carbohydrate. Phosphate also is soluble in water. So the hydrophilic region is soluble in water. That means it likes water. And this region below, the fatty acids, those are unsaturated fatty acids. So I'll write that. Unsaturated fatty acids. And those unsaturated fatty acids, well, water and fat, they don't like each other. So we call this the hydrophobic region. Hydrophobic region. Hydrophobic region means that it fears water, so that when we add a bunch of phospholipids to a bunch of water, what happens is these phospholipids, which we can represent in like cartoon version like this. So if we were to just draw it like a cartoon, we can draw it like that. Here is the hydrophilic region, and then these guys are the hydrophobic region, the fatty acid tails there. So if we were to add those to a bunch of water, this is what we get. So we get a bunch of phosphate heads plus the glycerol. And then on another layer would then start to form. And then we'd have those fatty acid tails, Okay, so now that we've drawn all of that, so what we have here is the same thing. This is our bilayer. So there's one layer, and then there's a second layer. So that's called a phospholipid bilayer, 2 layers of phospholipids, and the same situation happens. We have the hydrophobic region, still the fatty acid tails. Hydrophobic. And then these 2 phosphate heads here at the end, both of those are hydrophilic. So that guy and that guy. So notice that's facing on either side of the cell, the water. That's important. This is the structure of all membranes, but the one on the outside of the cell specifically is the plasma membrane. All right. The plasma membrane also includes some other stuff. Let's talk about some other stuff that's in the plasma membrane. So there's our phospholipids. I'm going to leave this picture of our cell membrane up here, or plasma membrane up here, so that we can add some stuff to it. So another thing also in the plasma membrane, we have proteins. And we can have two different types of proteins that we find in our plasma membrane. They have two different classes. Basically, the first class are peripheral proteins. Peripheral proteins are proteins that are found on the periphery, on the edges of the plasma membrane. So I don't know, let's draw in purple. That sounds fun. So if I draw in purple, I can have something like, let's add to my shapes here. Okay. So let's say a peripheral protein would be something like this on the outer edge of the shell. Something like this on the outer edge of the cell, or of that cell membrane rather, peripheral proteins. So peripheral proteins, they interact, oops, I want black, interact with the phosphate heads. And they interact with them on either the inside or on the outside of the cell, unlike the peripherals of that membrane. And we also have proteins that go all the way through, still a protein, so I'm still going to use purple. We can call these integrated proteins because they're integrated in the cell membrane. They go all the way through the cell, like that. All the way through the cell membrane. And so they kind of like force those phospholipids to kind of get out of the way. Those are called integrated proteins because they're integrated with the plasma membrane. Integrated proteins. They're just integrated with the plasma membrane. They go all the way across. Go all the way through the plasma membrane. So great. We're learning more as we go, but the functions of peripheral proteins and integrated proteins are really variable, just like the functions of proteins in general are really variable. Our integrated proteins can be things like channels, which we'll get into in our next video, that allow a specific type of molecule to pass through that protein. That's really important. But all right, like etc. There's a lot of other stuff that they do. And remember that proteins are made up of amino acids, and those amino acids, those building blocks of proteins, the monomers of proteins, have different qualities, and those different qualities of the amino acids, like if they're hydrophobic or hydrophilic or charged or not charged, and all of the other things that amino acids can be, influence what parts of the protein are inside the plasma membrane versus outside the plasma membrane, because we have the hydrophobic and hydrophilic regions. So if you find in an integrated protein, this region of the integrated protein is where we have all of those fats. So we're going to have more of those parts or those types of amino acids here that like fats more. Versus on the outside of this integrated protein, this guy and this guy, we're going to find more things that like water, more on the outside. Okay, so that's proteins, but we can also find something else inside the plasma membrane. Those are called sterols. Sterols. Sterols are lipids, like cholesterol sterols. Those are located in the hydrophobic region. Located in the hydrophobic region, and they have a really, really important function. Their function is to make more space. So a little bit of recall from previous lectures. These fatty acid tails here, those are unsaturated, which means that at room temperature, they're like oil, right? They're liquid at room temperature. So we need some space for molecules to be able to pass through the plasma membrane if needed. We need space, and that's what sterols do, is they create that space. Provide room so phospholipids can move. And they need to move so that molecules can pass through. So let's draw our sterols like this. Sterols, I'll draw in green just for funsies. So sterols, let's say, kind of like exist here. Just little molecules. Little fatty molecules. There's sterols here. I'm totally making up this structure. I have no idea what it actually looks like without looking it up online. So something like that. It just is embedded in that hydrophobic region within those fatty acid tails to kind of make more space so that we can kind of move around. Both of these things, proteins and sterols, make up this really cool kind of nickname that the plasma membrane has called fluid mosaic. A mosaic is like a bunch of tiny bits that make up a bigger picture, and that's what the plasma membrane is, like a fluid mosaic. It's kind of this fluid-like, because it can kind of move around, thing that allows all of these really great properties, like allowing molecules to pass through, but also keeping bad stuff out and good stuff in. And we'll get to that as we move forward. Okay, so to finish my point about sterols also add flexibility. Adds flexibility. So that the cell membrane isn't rigid, because the cell needs to be kind of loosey-goosey. It needs to move around. Okay, so let's finish off this video with the functions of the plasma membrane. So all of these things make up the structure of the plasma membrane, and then that gives the plasma membrane two really important functions. So functions, I should spell that right, functions of plasma membrane. There's two really important ones. One is protection. And that plasma membrane can be protected because, like I said, we're keeping the insides inside and the outsides outside. Keep insides inside and keep the outsides outside. To a point, though, because the second really important function of the plasma membrane, is called selective permeability. Selective permeability. Selective permeability means that certain substances are allowed to pass through. Certain substances can pass through. And this is really important because there's levels, there's checkpoints, there's qualities that molecules need to have in order to get across that plasma membrane, which is the whole subject of our next video. All right, I hope you have a great day and enjoy.